For over 2,000 years, artists of East Asia have painted and practiced calligraphy in much this way. The material they typically paint on is very thin and fragile paper or silk. These objects are backed and mounted in one of several formats. Each of these has its own uses and techniques of construction. A piece that is well mounted, given good care and a proper environment, may remain in good condition for several generations. The materials used in East Asian painting and mounting are fundamentally different from those used in the West. Canvas, which is much heavier than paper and silk, is pulled taut and fastened by its edges onto a wooden stretcher, and oil paint is quite a bit thicker than the pigments and inks used in China and Japan. An Asian mount is much more integrated with the work of art. Backings and borders are made of the finest quality papers and silks. These are fixed directly onto the painting using a water-soluble paste. The design of the mount is determined by the style of the painting. This is a Korean painting in the style of the literati. It's accompanied by a poem, and the colors are subdued, almost monochromatic. Accordingly, the mounter has chosen a silk brocade with an unobtrusive pattern, and the design of the mount is very simple. One band of color above and below, with the main body of the mount being a subtle ivory color. A painting can become soiled and damaged with age or an improper environment. This scroll from the early 1700s by the Japanese artist Cho Shun seems to have been exposed to both excessive humidity and dryness. There is some discoloration caused by mold, and the rod at the top and the roller at the bottom have been lost. Incorrect mounting can also damage a painting. This 19th century screen was poorly mounted in the 1930s and has deteriorated since then. There is worm damage to the interior of the core, and the joints are loose and warped. Because of the warping, some areas of the painting have cracked and there is some loss of pigment. The surface of the painting will be stabilized, then the painting will be remounted on a new core and new silk borders will be added. The mounters who perform this work are experts dedicated to the preservation of works of art. Mounters entrusted with precious works of art have a great responsibility. Asian art collectors realized this centuries ago. Liu Shihua, a collector during the Qing dynasty, warned, "If you cannot obtain the service of a good mounter for remounting your scrolls, even if they should be badly damaged, you had better leave them in a box. If you give a scroll to a clumsy mounter, then this is tantamount to destroying the scroll." He also said that a good mounter can be likened to a great sage or meritorious statesman. The art of mounting began in China in the 2nd century when paper and silk became popular for writing and painting. Hand scrolls were a very early form of the book in China, just as they were in the eastern Mediterranean region. They were lined with paper backings and sometimes had silk borders. The papers were relatively thick and the early pasting techniques were imperfect. This would have prevented the scrolls from lying flat when unrolled and caused the backing to crack. Mounting techniques were improved greatly in the following centuries, and with this improvement, paintings of paper and silk began to be mounted as screens. In traditional Chinese dwellings, screens, along with latticework partitions and bamboo curtains, were used to divide space. The early screens were made of solid wood, which may have been carved or inlaid with porcelain or jade or other stones. Literature as early as the 2nd century mentions painted screens. The early artists painted directly on the wooden surface. When paper and silk came into use, the paintings were stretched tight on a light wooden frame and then fit into the heavier, larger decorative frame of carved wood. Chinese hanging scrolls had their origin in a type of banner that is used in Buddhist temples. These were brought to China from India in the 4th and 5th centuries. The image is painted on cotton, and the borders and covering are silk. This covering is pulled back for festivals. All of the parts are sewn together, and a fabric backing is added to cover the seams. During the Tang Dynasty, in the early 7th century, Chinese mounters began to use the techniques they had developed for mounting hand scrolls with these Buddhist banners. In the following centuries, use of the hanging scrolls spread. The paintings to be mounted grew to be quite large, and the borders became wider and the backing became thinner and more flexible. The high, spacious rooms in the homes of Chinese art collectors could accommodate numbers of large scrolls. Collectors would hang paintings and calligraphy in their main halls used for public receptions, and in other rooms of the house, as well as in their gardens. Favorite scrolls would be brought out and admired on special occasions. In the 6th and 7th centuries, Chinese monks brought Buddhism to Japan. With Buddhism came temple architecture, religious painting, calligraphy, and other elements of Chinese culture, one of which was the folding screen. The folding screen in China and early Japan was made up of a series of panels with individual frames. These were hinged together with silk or leather cord. By the 15th century, the Japanese had developed a paper hinge that would allow folding in either direction. The individual panels were covered with sections of one continuous painting. The core of the screen is constructed from a lightweight wooden lattice that is covered with overlapping layers of paper. This provides a strong but flexible support for the painting. The painting is then mounted on this final layer of paper. Borders of gold and silk are added, and it is finally framed with a thin strip of lacquered wood. In addition, the sliding panels between rooms are often covered with large paintings. These are called fusuma, and they're constructed in much the same way as the folding screen. Some of the most impressive fusuma were painted for castles and Buddhist monasteries. The rooms were vast and dark, and the styles that artists developed used bold shapes and brilliant gold backgrounds. In the 13th century, the tokonoma appeared in Japanese architecture. The tokonoma is an alcove that was initially found in tea houses for use in the tea ceremony. Its purpose is for the display of one or two works of art. Japanese houses are fairly low-ceilinged, and the tokonoma is also small. These influence the size of Japanese scrolls, which tend to be smaller than those of the Chinese. The Japanese developed mounting into a refined and specialized art. Great tea masters of the 16th and 17th centuries became expert mounters and influenced the emerging Japanese styles. The parts and proportions of the borders were standardized, and different styles of mounts became associated with particular manners of painting. A modern mounter may turn to a Japanese handbook for inspiration and guidance in designing a mount. Creativity is used, but guidelines have been set down by tradition. The highly refined aesthetic of mounting grew out of centuries of development in styles and techniques. The screen and scroll became important formats for displaying paintings and developed into distinctly different Chinese and Japanese forms. The close integration of a painting with its mount demands skill and sensitivity from the mounter. A poorly constructed mount will damage the work, but a good one contributes to its preservation, allowing it to expand and contract with changes in the atmosphere. And the mount harmonizes visually with the painting, the design, colors, and patterns of the borders echoing the painting's style and character.